Tonight on the Worldview Report, a new poll reveals the shocking results of what Americans believe on the potential for a second civil war amid the recent nationwide riots and politically motivated shootings in Minnesota. The U.S. House of Representatives passes a Republican-sponsored bill to prevent future administrations from prohibiting oil and gas drilling without the consent of Congress, handing President Trump a significant win. Kraft Heinz says it will remove all chemical dyes from its U.S. foods by the end of 2027, amid pressure from the Trump administration to phase out artificial colors from the nation's food supply. And what happens after the mullahs abdicate their stronghold on Iran? We have a full report, including a fresh poll on what Americans believe is the proper U.S. response to the latest Middle East war. All these stories and more as the Worldview Report begins right now.
This is Worldview Report with host Brandon House. Whether it is news from the nation's capital or your state capital, from the classroom to the boardroom, from national security to national and local news that impacts you and your family, Worldview Report is your trusted source for vital and uncensored news. And now, here is Brandon House.
Good evening, and welcome to the Worldview Report. I'm Brandon House. Leading off tonight, 40% of Americans believe a civil war in the U.S. is somewhat or very likely within the next decade. That's what a new YouGov poll released on Tuesday suggests. The poll, which surveyed 3,375 adults, underscores widespread anxiety over the nation's deepening divisions. It also follows a wave of unrest in the country, including violent protests against federal deportations and nationwide demonstrations aimed at President Donald Trump. Women were more likely than men to consider civil conflict plausible, with 45% indicating it was likely. Views also varied by political affiliation. 48% of Democrats, 39% of independents, and 32% of Republicans said a civil war was at least somewhat probable, while respondents were more or less split on the likelihood of a civil war. Just over 20% were unsure or declined to even answer. The data also suggested racial disparities. Among white respondents, 10% said a civil war was very likely, compared to 18% of black respondents. Hispanics were the least likely to completely dismiss the idea, with only 11% saying a conflict was, quote, not likely at all, end quote, while 15% called it very likely. Israel said that its campaign to destroy Iran's military infrastructure has scored a major victory by degrading its command infrastructure. Journalist Yashir Ali posted on X, quote, the Israeli Defense Forces say they have killed the chief of the Islamic Republic of Iran's armed forces. Ali Shamani had only been in the position for a few days. He was appointed after his predecessor was killed by the Israeli military just days earlier, end quote. Shamani was in charge of Iran's military emergency command for about 4 days. That's according to the Times of Israel. Major General Gholam Ali Rashid, who was Shamani's predecessor, was killed Friday when Israel opened its attack on Iran. The IDF said Shamani was the most senior military commander remaining and the war chief of staff, who it considered the closest military commander to Ayatollah Khomeini. That's, of course, Iran's supreme leader. The IDF statement said as follows, quote, he commanded both the Revolutionary Guards and the Iranian armed forces. In his various roles, he had a direct influence on Iran's offensive plans, targeting the state of Israel, end quote. Legislation was passed 226 to 188 by the Republican-controlled House to prevent future administrations from prohibiting oil and gas drilling. without the consent of Congress, giving President Donald Trump another significant win. The Protecting American Energy Production Act, as it was called, was passed by lawmakers in a vote on Friday, which forbids the president from, quote, declaring a moratorium on the use of hydraulic fracturing unless Congress authorizes the moratorium, end quote. Republican House members unanimously voted in favor of the legislation's passage, while 118 Democrats voted against it. Just weeks before he left office, former President Joe Biden banned future oil and gas drilling along 625 million acres of coastal and offshore waters, among other oil and gas-related regulations. The Republican lawmaker who introduced the bill, he's from Texas, stated that the legislation was prompted by worries about possible fracking bans during the Biden regime. In a statement following the bill, the congressman said, quote, when President Biden took office, his administration took a whole of government approach to wage war on American energy production, pandering to woke environmental extremists and crippling this thriving industry. My legislation that passed today is a necessary first step in reversing Biden's war on energy by preventing the federal government from banning the use of hydraulic fracturing, end quote. As part of his baby drill strategy, President Trump has pledged to unleash energy production in the United States. The Post-Millennial reports that a former Coast Guard lieutenant who received awards for skills in sharpshooting was arrested Monday for allegedly leveling a series of violent death threats towards President Donald Trump. That's according to a newly unsealed court document. Peter Stinson, a resident of Oakton, Virginia, served as an officer in the U.S. Coast Guard until 2021 and also worked as an instructor for FEMA's Incident Command Systems. That's according to his criminal complaint. Prosecutors, they say he was also a self-identified member of the Antifa movement and used his X and Blue Sky accounts to send threatening posts targeting President Trump from 2020 through this year. Prosecutors say his threats were not isolated incidents. The complaint includes several other messages where Stinson allegedly suggested he would pull the trigger or offered to be the driver if someone else would go through with an attack on President Trump. Meanwhile, a 25-year-old Georgia man faces federal charges for allegedly making violent threats against U.S. Senators Ted Cruz of Texas and Deb Fischer of Nebraska, as well as Cruz's family. That's what the Department of Justice announced. Robert Davis Forney of Duluth, Georgia, was indicted by a federal grand jury on June 10th and charged with communicating threats in interstate commerce. He appeared before a federal magistrate judge in Atlanta on Monday for arraignment. According to prosecutors, Forney left threatening voicemails in January targeting Cruz and Fischer, including threats of sexual violence against both senators and Cruz's family. If convicted, Forney could face federal prison time. The charges, they come amid heightened concerns about violence against political figures. Of course, that follows the recent targeted attacks in Minnesota, where former State House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband were murdered, and State Senator John Hoffman and his wife were shot. Authorities, they arrested the suspect, Vance Bolter, after a 2-day manhunt in that case. Kraft Heinz announced on Tuesday that it will remove all chemical dyes from its U.S. foods by the end of 2027. That's amid pressure from the Trump administration to phase out artificial colors from the nation's food supply. Kraft, which is one of the largest food and drink manufacturers in North America, they also said that they would not launch any new products in the U.S. with artificial colors effective immediately. Kraft Heinz said it was working with licensees of its brands to encourage them to remove artificial colors, which are often referred to as FD&C colors. because they can also be used in drugs and cosmetics and are subject to a system of approval under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Pedro Navia, Kraft Heinz president of North America operations, said in a statement, quote, "The vast majority of our products use natural or no colors. And we've been on a journey to reduce our use of FD&C colors across the remainder of our portfolio," end quote. Navio said the company's well-known tomato ketchup has never included artificial dyes, noting that the red color comes from the tomatoes that it's made with. Well, folks, this is good news because, as my family knows, when I order French fries, I use a lot of ketchup. The company did, however, remove artificial colors, preservatives, and flavors from its Kraft mac and cheese back in 2016. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has focused his efforts on cutting out the artificial colors since being sworn into office earlier this year. Studies have linked the dyes to hyperactivity in children and a host of other health problems. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello, I'm Brandon House. I want to thank you for all your support at WVWFoundation.com that helps make possible pushing out 24/7 content for free. Without your support, we'd have to put it all behind a paywall. But thanks to you and your support through our foundation, we're able to push it out for free as a broadcast service and broadcast ministry of WVW Foundation. Please consider going there and setting up an automatic monthly contribution, or go there and make an occasional contribution. If you prefer to support us through the mail, you'll find our mailing address there at WVWFoundation.com. You can also call and make your contribution over the phone by calling 901-825-0652. That's 901-825-0652. Again, all these details are available at WVWFoundation.com. Thank you for your support as we try to help people around the world understand the times through the lens of a Christian worldview. Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview. Welcome back. Thanks for being with us tonight and for always remembering we are brought to you by you. We are a listener-supported network. Did you hear me? We are a listener and viewer-supported network. We need your support. And like most organizations, there's just a small group that supports us. The vast majority, they watch and benefit from the small minority that supports us. Will you please join the small group of individuals that support us? We really do need to see more of you supporting us, because I know there are so many of you out there that appreciate what we do, and you can support us. To those that cannot, don't you worry about it, because you can still pray for us and you can promote us, right? But for those of you that can financially support us, we need your support now. We're producing so much content every day at Worldview Tube. We've got Worldview Tube, which is obviously television, Worldview Radio, that's cranking out tons of radio shows, not just mine, but others. And then we have Worldview Times that puts out free articles. So we're radio, TV, and print. We also have a Sunday night church service. Lord willing, I'll be back this Sunday night, continuing my series with Lesson 41 as I teach through the book of Revelation. I'm continuing in Revelation chapter 17. So thank you now for your support at worldviewfoundation.com, worldviewfoundation.com. You'll also find our mailing address there if you prefer to support us through the mail. And if you prefer to make a contribution over the phone, you can simply call the phone number on the website at worldviewfoundation.com, leave a voicemail for Melissa or text her, and she'll get back to you and help you make that contribution over the phone. So thank you for doing that. All the details at worldviewfoundation.com. Hey, don't forget about our fall conference coming up. The first weekend of October, our 22nd annual national conference. This year, it is right outside of Memphis, Tennessee, about 30 minutes outside of Memphis, and the very safe middle class, upper class community of Collierville, Tennessee. Memphis gets a bad rap, but folks, it'd be like saying you don't ever want to go to St. Louis or Kansas City. Obviously, there are great suburbs in St. Louis and Kansas City. Or saying you don't ever want to go to Milwaukee. No, there's great suburbs. Every city has its problems today, but poor Memphis, the Bluff City, gets picked on. But we're in a beautiful suburb, about 30 minutes from the Memphis airport, which is brand newly remodeled. So come on over, drive in. All the details, if you're interested, are at worldviewstore.com. What a lineup we have for this fall. And we've slashed the ticket price this year because moving it to the Mid-South is going to greatly cut our cost. Okay? So we're passing that savings on to you. And all the details are at worldviewstore.com. Department of Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem was transported to a hospital in Washington, D.C. area by ambulance. That was on Tuesday. Noem is 53 and has been at the center of leftist protest over her intense crackdown on illegal immigration. Noem reportedly had an allergic reaction. It was taken for treatment out of an abundance of caution. Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin said in a statement to Fox News, quote, Secretary Noem had an allergic reaction today. She was transported to the hospital out of an abundance of caution. She is alert and recovering, end quote, and we wish her well. U.S. President Donald Trump will issue another extension to decide the fate of TikTok, pushing it back another 90 days. That's what the White House said on Tuesday. The current extension, which was signed in April, was set to expire on Thursday, June 19th. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said in a statement to CBS News, quote, President Trump will sign an additional executive order this week to keep TikTok up and running. And as he has said many times, President Trump does not want TikTok to go dark. This extension will last 90 days, which the administration will spend working to ensure this deal is closed so that the American people can continue to use TikTok with the assurance that their data is safe and secure, end quote. In January, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the law to ban TikTok, resulting in app stores and service providers pulling support for the app in the U.S. Just a few days after taking office, President Trump, he signed an executive order to delay the ban so he could explore a deal with ByteDance so they could divest TikTok into this U.S. business. On April 4th, he issued another extension of 75 days to keep the Chinese-owned short video app up and running. Last week, independent Senators Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine introduced legislation that would ban pharmaceutical companies from promoting prescription drugs directly to consumers, including through television or radio, print, digital, and social media. On Tuesday, Bloomberg reports that the Trump administration, well, they're now, quote, discussing policies that would make it harder and more expensive for pharmaceutical companies to advertise directly to patients, end quote. Although the U.S. is the only place besides New Zealand where big pharma companies can directly advertise, banning pharmaceutical ads outright, well, that could make the administration vulnerable to lawsuits. So instead, it's focusing on cutting down on the practice by adding legal and financial hurdles. That's what Bloomberg reported. They were citing people that are familiar with the plans, but who are not identified. The two policies the administration has focused in on would be to require greater disclosures of side effects of a drug within each ad, likely making broadcast ads much longer and too expensive. And then there's the idea of removing the industry's ability to deduct direct-to-consumer advertising as a business expense on their taxes. This is what has been told to Bloomberg. If this happens, it would mark a major victory for Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who says he believes Americans consume more drugs than people in other countries due to the ability of U.S. drug companies to directly advertise to consumers. While running for president, Mr. Kennedy said he would, issue an executive order if he would have become president, removing pharmaceutical ads from television, citing over-medication and industry influence on news coverage. You mean the pharmaceutical companies maybe pay a broadcast outlet so much money that broadcast outlet would censor stories about various drugs or drug companies? Well, guess what? We're not sponsored by pharmaceutical drug companies here. Never have been, never will be. We're a listener-supported network. Now, this move, it would mark a sweeping shift in the U.S. advertising landscape, where, as you know, pharmaceutical companies, well, they are among the largest spenders. Prescription drug brands, they account for roughly 13% of all ad spending on, terrestrial television. That's in 2025. And guess what it totals? Right around $2.18 billion. Yeah, $2.18 billion. So far this year for 2025. That's according to iSpot data. Since 1997, when the Food and Drug Administration relaxed the disclosure requirements, these pharmaceutical companies have increasingly leaned on consumer advertising to drive demand. Under current rules, companies need only to disclose the drug's, quote, most important, end quote, risks during the commercials. Well, now it is time for our nightly Worldview Report commentary. Israel, they continue to pound Iran, while the Iranian regime's missile response, seems to be getting more feeble with each passing night. Both sides have been warning that they may have some big surprises up their sleeves as the war is about to enter its second week. But on the ground, it appears Israel has the upper hand, having established air dominance over the skies of Iran and now working on degrading what could be the final missile launching site in western Iran. President Trump, he's called on the Iranian regime to announce its unconditional surrender, and multiple reports, they say he's no longer in the mood to negotiate with Iran's crumbling regime, and he's given them one last chance, maybe a day, to wave the white flag and give up. If you don't surrender and continue to lob missiles at Israel, President Trump, he's threatened to unleash the U.S. Air Force on them. So the war is no longer just about the denuclearization of Iran. It's about doing another Middle East regime change. That has not worked out too well in the past, but maybe this time will be different. Only time will tell. as we only have to wait and see what the Americans and the Israelis have planned for Iran's future in terms of, well, the government that will replace the mullahs. But what do American citizens want? And will direct U.S. involvement in the Israel-Iran war split the MAGA movement? A new poll, well, it really has the answer, and it's pretty overwhelming. The Economist YouGov poll, that was released on Tuesday, and it found that 60% of Americans said that the U.S. military should not get involved in this conflict. An additional 16% said yes, while 24% were unsure. Of course, this was reflective across genders, political parties, races, with 59% of men, 60% of women, 65% of Democrats, 53% of independents, 59% of white Americans, 55% of black Americans, and 64% of Hispanic Americans responding as such. Respondents, well, they were also asked, what strategy should the U.S. employ to get Iran to limit its nuclear program? To which 28% said Iran should be threatened with stronger economic sanctions. 26% said the U.S. should incentivize Iran with the resumption of diplomatic relations. And 24% said the U.S. should incentivize the country by easing economic sanctions. And the largest response to this question was 30% at not sure. A little over half of all respondents said the U.S. should engage in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. That was at 56%. While 18% said the U.S. should not negotiate and use military force against the regime. So the question really is this. Would direct military action against Iran by the U.S. military have a negative effect on the MAGA movement, Trump's base? I think it will. The extent of the damage to this coalition, well, it may depend on how the American attack is carried out and whether there is any, well, protracted U.S. military presence in Iran. But I think it would be very naive to think that there'll be no political fallout. So let's pray for President Trump. Let's pray that he has good wisdom, godly wisdom, in whatever decision he makes in what is really a rapidly escalating war. Pray for President Trump and for Israel. That does it for this edition of the Worldview Report. As always, we thank you for tuning in and supporting the broadcast. Since we are not sponsored by the pharmaceutical companies, you can support us directly at worldviewfoundation.com, worldviewfoundation.com. Thank you for doing that. So next time, I'm Brandon House. May God save America. Take care.